Next up, we have a presentation about pulse insect issues. Research updates from 2021 and prospects for 2022. Provided by James Tansey, Provincial Specialist of Insect and Vertebrate Pest Management for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Before joining the ministry, James worked in row crop entomology research in Alberta, citrus systems in Florida, pharmaceutical research in Idaho, on dust mites and regulatory affairs. Welcome, James.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for accommodating my remote presentation. I hope everyone can see the screen. Okay, pulse insect issues. Grasshoppers, of course, were a big story. We had localized heavy pressure, many accounts of spraying. We also had some shortages of some control products. And as some of you are probably aware, most of you are probably aware, we've had a deregulation decision for chlorpyrifos. So December of next year will be the final date of use. So be aware of alternatives. So there are a lot of alternatives for grasshoppers. Some of them, like Coragen, are quite effective. We're going to talk about the different pest species. Reason being is we've got 85 species of grasshoppers in the province. In Saskatchewan, typically only about 4 of these are ever problematic. So we're going to talk about these 4 species. And reason being is that they do have different host preferences. So they can be relatively more or less important to pulse crops, depending on their host preferences. And I'll provide a couple of anecdotes just to illustrate that. One that's quite important is the migratory grasshopper. Some characteristics that you can use to identify these in the field are these the 2 bands on the hind femur, very characteristic. The red coloration on the hind tibia, very characteristic. And a little tougher to see in the field is this mottled pattern on the forewing. They're not as large as some of the other pest grasshoppers, so this is going to be about 1 inch long, the females. Typically, the females are larger than the males, more than typically. That's almost always the case, which is the case with most insects and other arthropods. They are broadly omnivorous. They do prefer forbs, grasses, wheat, barley, and other crops. But when push comes to shove, they will feed on other dead insects, functionally any organic matter they find on the ground. They will strip the bark off of small trees as well. And for those of you planting new willows, if we do get a major outbreak of these animals, expect some damaged sheer willows, like I saw this last spring. So ornamentals can be effective, as can small trees. Something that should be illustrated too is they engage in what's called migratory behaviors. So we're all pretty familiar with the desert locust, or maybe the lever locust, the desert locust from the old world, and the lever locust from the Southeast United States. There isn't really a taxonomic connection with locusts. I mean, they're all members of the same larger group, but they're not more closely related if they engage in this behavior. So locust is really a way of life rather than a designation of any kind of interrelatedness. These ones engage in that kind of behavior, though. So when they are at high densities, they'll engage in gregarious behavior and migratory behavior. So the nymphs, keep in mind, they don't have wings at this point. They can walk up to 10 miles a day, walk and hop. So they can be very mobile, and they can move at in large numbers. Adults, of course, are winged, and they'll take flight, and they can fly to great heights, and sometimes in very large numbers. There was an account from 1938 of a 1,000-kilometer migration from South Dakota to Saskatchewan. And in the next slide, I'll illustrate a migration that was captured on radar last year. Again, at great heights, so commercial pilots have reported strikes at 3,000 feet. Oh, sorry. Next, we'll move on to another animal. I've got the radar image in an upcoming slide, and I'll discuss that when it comes. Packards Grasshopper was a little less common this past year, but these girls are big. So 1.1 to 1.3 inches. As you can see, the range extends over the bulk of North America, much like migratory grasshopper. These ones are a little fussier as far as habitat goes, and they prefer open habitat, light textured soils. Reason being is they're ovipositing or depositing eggs with the tip of their abdomen, and they're sticking it right in the soil. The girls are, that is. Males, as a rule, don't lay eggs. The light texture soils help them to get penetrance into the soil with their ovipositors. Really characteristic about these ones, typically lighter colored than some of the other species you might see, and can border on this pale yellow as illustrated here. The two light stripes on the pronotum, or that plate right behind the head, very characteristic. You see how the stripes don't extend to the tip of the wings, and the blue hind tibia is frequently seen in this species as well. These ones like vegetables, small grains, but really prefer legumes. So these ones can be a pretty significant problem for pulse crops. When they're adults, they're a big beefy animal, so they can cause a lot of damage. A relatively close relative of those is the Twostrike Grasshopper. And characteristics, you can see that stripe extends all the way from between the eyes right to the tip of the forewings. Another really characteristic feature of these animals is that dark stripe on the hind femur, and you're going to see that in nymphs as well. So the nymphs are a bright green, and you're going to see this black stripe, and this can give an indication of what to expect later in the year. As a rule, we don't typically advise inflicting control on populations of nymphs unless a lot of damage is being accumulated. And reason being is that there's a lot that can happen between nymphal stages and adulthood, or even the late nymphal stages. They can be consumed by a large number of different animals and insects, and suffer from disease and climatological catastrophes. So if you see large numbers of nymphs, it may indicate a problem later. Probably best to consider this as a heads up and a reason to keep an eye on that area. They prefer lush habitat and heavier textured soil zones and lush foliage. So they'll be commonly seen in ditches and around sloughs where the plants are a little bit more lush. They can be important pests of alfalfa and other crops, and will also feed on cereals. And as from the map you can see here, they're found all over North America as well. Another important pest, and this is the last major pest species that we're going to talk about, is the Clearwing Grasshopper. A little bit smaller than Twostrike or Packards, but can be very important. This one is primarily a grass feeder, and what's characteristic about these ones, you can see the camouflage pattern on their forewings, and very characteristic of these animals. And again, they're a little bit smaller than Twostrikes or Packards Grasshopper. The stripe you can see on the back doesn't extend across the pronotum. So whereas in Twostrike, you would see that extending all the way from between the eyes all the way across the forewings. In this case, it pretty much starts at the forewing. Another really important characteristic of these ones is what are called carinae, or these ridges across the pronotum. And you can see that there. It looks like a little keel running across there. Can be difficult to see in the field, but very characteristic. I mentioned that these ones are grass feeders, and the reason why this is important is one site that I visited last year and the previous year had really dense populations of clearwing grasshoppers, and they were doing a lot of damage to a rangeland area, and in the previous year they were doing a lot of damage to wheat fields in the area. But although they were at high densities on a lentil field, they weren't causing damage. It seemed that they were just using these as basking sites to get their internal temperature up before they moved on to other crops. So they were doing a lot of damage to wheat in that area, but not no appreciable damage to the lentil crop. Oh, this is the satellite image that I was talking about associated with migratory grasshopper. So this was taken last year in July. This is at about 10,000 feet. So there's enough of these beasts to be picked up by radar, and this is over northern Montana and southern Saskatchewan. So large number of animals flying at great height. We do a survey, or SAIC does a survey from the Ministry of Agriculture of 11 to 1,200 sites annually. In this past year, we saw densities of greater than 30 per square meter at least 2 sites, one near Enterprise and Maple Creek in the southwest. And the site that I visited in near Maple Creek was a mustard field that was suffering a lot of damage from Twostrike Grasshopper. It was also characterized by large numbers of these Epicota blister beetles. So these relatively large gray blister beetles. The black ones are called nuttalls, or the black kind of glistening ones, and those ones are actually predators of solitary bees. So the Epicotas are the ones that are as larvae munching on grasshopper eggs. The numbers of Epicota blister beetles on the site was enormous. So they seem to be tracking the grasshopper population. Also saw several large populations of field crickets, and a lot of these were associated with large populations of grasshoppers. These things are broadly omnivorous, and they're seeking out the eggs. So for 2021, we had several sites over 10 per square meter, and so that's at threshold or higher for most crops, and approaching threshold at more than 50 sites. So the thresholds for most crops, typically 10 to 12 per square meter. Under ideal growing conditions, they can typically take a little bit more foliar damage, but this is a good ballpark to remember. Lentil and flax are more sensitive, or flax and boll, and you should consider 2 per square meter to your action threshold on those. So the 2021 and 2022 grasshopper forecasts, we've seen an increase over year to year. So this monitoring will continue. A thing to consider is that we had very good conditions for egg laying and for egg development last year, and depending on what the season looks like this coming year, we could be looking at an increase over what we've seen here. So although we did have some significant hotspots throughout the province, and control was required over some relatively broad areas, there's still potential for this to get we'll say more populous than we saw last year, and more control required. Some non-pest grasshoppers. So these are things you typically don't need to worry about spraying for. I mentioned before, 85 species of grasshopper in the province. Only 4 of these are typically important. A good mantra is if it has wings in the spring, it's not a pest. And a real good example of that was this speckled wing grasshopper. Got lots of calls about these, and my place was covered in. So they are munchers of rangeland grasses, very rarely a problem in crops. So noisy flyers, decent sized animal, they're about an inch long, and these blood red hind wings were characteristic. There are different color morphs, and this can range to yellow. One that we get calls on in the late summer is the Carolina grasshopper, which is again a noisy flyer, very large animal. That's that big gray beast on the top right there. Characteristic yellow hind wings, again a noisy flyer. Very rarely do these occur at numbers that are problematic and require control. So good to know your species. So what to expect for this year? Looking at a model developed by Owen Olford at Ag Canada and published in 2020, suggests that they had really good conditions for egg laying. So we had good densities of population, so boy could meet girl relatively easily. Good conditions for development as far as temperature went, early emergence and development of adults, and so that oviposition period was relatively long. So these girls had a lot of time to get their eggs into the soil. The conditions were good for getting the eggs into the soil. So it looks very much like a lot of eggs were in stored up for this upcoming season. They go through a period of diapause in the winter, so their development is actually going to shut down, but their success is based in part on how much development can be accumulated by those eggs before the winter season comes, and they had very good conditions for that. I was witnessing oviposition or egg laying right into October, and although these girls were looking a little bit beat up, a lot of 4- and 5-legged two-stripe grasshopper females, they were still pumping eggs into the ground. So based on this, we could have a pretty significant population or populations of some grasshoppers this coming season. Another really important consideration is the amount of moisture that's available in the spring. So plants need to green up when the nymphs come up. So if everything is really dry and the nymphs don't have anything to eat when they emerge in May, typically mid-May, late May, then they can actually starve. Rainfall events can cause direct mortality in the spring as well. So look for those, and later in the season, hot, sticky conditions can contribute to fungal infections. So that's another thing to look out for. All in all, we could be looking at an increase in grasshoppers, but it depends entirely on what happens in the upcoming season. Next animal I'll talk about is Ligas. Reason it's italicized, this is actually a complex of different species. They're all in the same genus, Ligas, so the convention is to italicize. So we got Borealis, Lineolaris, Lysis, Hesperus, and Peltoni. All of these have very broad host ranges, so we'll feed on in excess of 300 different host species. All of these species are listed in canola. Lineolaris and Peltoni tend to prefer faba. Sean Prager at the U of S leads a survey on these in faba, and in 2021, 12 quarter sections were sampled, 10 samples from each of 10 sites. 9 of these sites had Ligas, and the most densely infested field had 238. So that is more than 5 times the population seen in 2020, and about 2.4 per sweep. So on average, 9.6 Ligas per quarter section, and most were east of Highway 2 and north of Highway 16. So I'll talk a little bit about economic thresholds for different insects. For these ones, they're still being worked out, but we did have substantial populations on at least one site. The reason that these are important particularly in pulse crops is because they're piercing sucking feeders. They inject a salivary protein called polygalacturonase into their intended food. They're fluid feeders, so you can see they're piercing sucking mouth parts. They need to draw up liquid, and this digestive enzyme helps to liquefy their meal. Early seeding can help with late season pressure. For faba, crop flowering to mid-pod is the most vulnerable stage, and their feeding can result in discoloration of the seed coat, hull perforations, and seed pitting. They can influence yield, although they typically don't. They're more of a quality issue than a yield issue if the feeding results in the shedding of buds, flowers, and pods. As I mentioned before, more of a quality issue than a yield issue, and so your market should be considered when you're making your control decisions. If these are going for animal feed, then the quality issues are likely less important than if they're going for human consumption. So the best time to control likely at early pod. There is no current threshold. We have early recommendations of no action at 2 per sweep. So that is, consider that to be your action threshold. It is nominal, but that's what we have for the time being. Both Hector Carcamo and Sean Prager are looking at this, and we'll have more information. There are products registered for their control, and just so you're aware, in faba. So adults emerge from the plant after molt. They're going to be seeking flowering plants, mating on these plants, and then moving to alfalfa and canola. They can't resist the draw of that many delicious flowers. You're going to see egg laying in those crops May, June, and July, because you get this overlapping oviposition or this overlapping egg laying. You're going to get representation of all kinds of different nymphal stages. So, but typically one generation per year. First nymphs are going to start appearing at the end of May. In the south, new generation adults are going to appear by the end of June. They're going to move to faba after the crop matures or is harvested. So you're going to see this mass exodus of adults flying to faba late season. Populations are influenced by temperature, relative humidity, and natural enemies. Egg production is greatest and development is shortest at 30 degrees Celsius. So some of these animals really like it hot. And in the case of Ligas, that is absolutely the case. Under high relative humidity conditions, fungal pathogens can be very important, and rainfall can cause direct mortality of the nymphs by knocking them off the plants. That can influence their survivorship, and it also puts them into the waiting arms of natural enemies at the base of plants. We also have an important genus of parasitoids called Parastinus, and a couple of species of those, and you can see one in the illustration there, jabbing her ovipositor into a Ligas nymph. So one question that we get fairly regularly is this a Ligas nymph or is this a P aphid? And I'll illustrate some of the differences here. In the case of Ligas, 3 things to look for. Level of activity, they're considerably more active than P aphid. P aphid are relatively slow movers, seem to walk around like their boots are stuck in the mud. They're not in any hurry to get anywhere. Ligas, on the other hand, much more active. You can see the shape of the face is pointed. They have the structure is called a clypeus, and think of it like the pump for their piercing sucking mouth parts. Quite pointed in Ligas, very rounded face in P aphids, and you can see the arrow pointing on P aphids to a structure called cornicles, or what are colloquially called butt snorkels in the ento world. Entomologist. That's all I'm going to say about that. These are not used for breathing. They're actually used for the release of alarm pheromones. So if an aphid is being munched on, it can produce a warning to its sisters that it's surrounded by, that there is danger, and they can walk away slowly. Oh, sorry, I should mention too, we did have many reports in canola, flax, and although fewer reports, we did have some reports in pulses as well. P. leaf weevil is also surveyed for in the province of Saskatchewan. Can be important in pulse crops. Happily, I'll kind of cut to the chase here. Numbers have been relatively low in the past few years. We do continue to survey for this. It is invasive, and it is continuing to work its way north and east. So what we're looking for are feeding notches, and you can see these on this pea plant in a lower illustration. So the short-snouted weevils are really characteristic notch feeders. The damaging stage, however, though, is the larva, and you can see that on the top illustration. These are actually tunneling into nodes and feeding. So as I mentioned before, the range continues to expand, now in Manitoba and working its way north in Saskatchewan. Numbers again low, but increasing slightly, particularly in the northeast this past year. So we're going to continue to look at these. We do have some modeling that indicates that these animals are sensitive to very cold temperatures, particularly when there isn't snow cover to insulate them. This year we had snow cover, however, so we'll see what this does with the upcoming population. As a rule, we don't recommend insecticides, foliar insecticides, to control these. Seed dressings are the most effective. The results for foliar applications are mixed at best. So from 2020 to 2021, although numbers remain low, as you can see here, we do have an increase in the northeast, and so we will continue to monitor for these animals in the upcoming year. Pea aphid, an important pest of pea, faba bean, and lentil. Relatively low pressure for 2021. No reports of spraying. One really curious fact about this animal, you can see that there's a rose-colored color morph and a green-colored color morph. One of the factors that drives this difference is the predators that are munching on them. Some insects see red better than others. Many insects do not see red at all, and so this could be a way for them to hide on plants, depending on where the vision of their predators lie. We had no reports of spraying this past year, despite the fact that we had some relatively significant mid-season arrival. They're migratory, so they push up from the U.S. And we did have some reports of early season arrival, but no reports of spraying going down for these animals. And I'll talk about why we think that was the case. Continued work on economic thresholds is ongoing by Drs. Wist and Prager, as is insecticide timing and planting dates. So we're working on this in ministry under the SFP umbrella, and Drs. Wist and Prager are also looking at this. Some recent work that was completed by a student of Drs. Wist and Prager determined the economic threshold for faba of P aphid was 103 to 164 aphids per main branch, and this allows 7 days lead time. So that is, if the population is increasing, and periodic monitoring is essential for this. If the population is continuing to increase, this will give you a 7-day heads up on control. So I mentioned before, we are looking at a trial under SFP, and I'll just cover this very briefly. We're looking at field peas and lentils. It's a mix of small plot and large plot. So 3 locations for small plot, a couple of locations for large plot. Looking mid-May, late May, and early June for seeding dates, and insecticide application with Matador as a control, so no application pre-flower and post-flower. As I mentioned before, aphid pressure was very low in 2020 and 2021 at the trial sites, but we did see a significant effective year, owing largely, I think, to the dry conditions in 2021. I'm just going to present results from a couple of sites. The overall trend was very similar. So significant effective planting date, earlier is better. And because of the low numbers of aphids, we didn't see an effective insecticide timing, or not a significant effect. Similar for lentils. Once again, significant effective planting date where earlier is better, but no effective insecticide owing to the low numbers of P. aphid that we're seeing. So early seeding is thought to be important because of better use of available soil moisture, increased probability of receiving precipitation, reduce heat stress during flowering, and avoiding some insect problems, earlier harvesting, and better quality, and of course the good frost tolerance of peas and lentils contributing to this. It should be mentioned too that one of our sites was irrigated, so although it does make some sense that this probability of receiving precipitation and soil moisture, and maybe even some of the heat stresses during flowering are influential. There are other factors that are more important, and this I think, because of the irrigated site, illustrates this pretty well. So here's what we think was happening with P. aphid. They're not very heat tolerant. I mentioned before that Ligas is an animal that really likes it hot. The grasshopper species that I mentioned really like it hot. These ones not so much. 15 to 20 seems to be about their happy spot. They do require 5.7 degrees Celsius to develop. Lowest juvenile mortality is highest at about 27, so they're not very heat tolerant at all. Lowest mortality at about 20. Fecundity, or you can see this girl squeezing out a baby. They do this most efficiently at 15 degrees Celsius. So if you look at the graph on the bottom there, this is the mortality on a control plot associated with temperature, and you can see the mortality increases dramatically into the 30s. Coupled with this, and a bit of a double whammy for the aphid populations, the activity levels of one of their important predators, in this case, this is a ladybird beetle called Harmonia, and invasive, unfortunately, but you can see its activity level actually increases with temperature. So you get this double whammy of reduced physiological suitability of the aphids under hot conditions, and the natural, or at least one natural enemy, is increasing its activity. So we suspect that was contributing very much to very low P. aphid numbers in the past year. So with that, I'd like to thank the people listed for contributing to our surveys and to some of our research work. This QR code links directly to our sign up for pest monitoring programs. We have a permission-based pest monitoring program currently, and we require permission, so that is people sign up for it. So really appreciate it if you could just point your cameras at that little menu will drop down, and you can sign up. And with that, I will take any questions.